The midday sun beat down mercilessly on the parched fields, baking the earth into a brittle, cracked mosaic. A cacophony of frustrated shouts and the guttural coughs of a dying engine tore through the air, a soundtrack to the unfolding disaster. In the center of it all, the colossal combine harvester, usually a symbol of rural prosperity, lay defeated, its intricate gears and belts a mangled mess. Farmers, their faces grimed with sweat and desperation, circled it like vultures, their shoulders slumped under the weight of a harvest hanging by a thread. The air was thick with the scent of dust, diesel, and despair, each breath a reminder of their dwindling hopes. This wasn't just a machine, it was their lifeline, and it had snapped. A young boy, Elias, stood apart from the agitated crowd, his small frame almost swallowed by the vastness of the fields. He clutched a worn, dog-eared book to his chest. His eyes, however, were not on the pages, but fixated on the broken harvester. The sharp words of Mr. Abernathy, the farm foreman, echoed in his ears. "Get out of the way, Elias! You're just a distraction." A familiar sting of dismissal. He was always in the way, always a distraction, an unwanted shadow in a world that moved too fast and spoke too loud. The raw injustice of the moment, the palpable fear of the farmers, and his own powerlessness pressed down on him, a heavy, invisible weight. The frantic energy around the harvester intensified. Tools clanged against metal, voices grew sharper, and the sense of urgency became almost unbearable. Elias, despite the commotion, remained rooted, his gaze unblinking. He saw not a jumble of metal, but a complex puzzle, a symphony of interconnected parts, each with a specific purpose. The frustration of the adults was a foreign language to him, but the machine's silent plea, its mechanical distress, resonated deeply within his unique understanding. He longed to quiet the chaos, to bring order to the mechanical disarray, but knew his attempts would only be met with more scorn. A group of boys, slightly older than Elias, snickered from a safe distance, their whispers like venomous insects. "Look at Elias, always staring at nothing," one sneered, kicking a clod of dirt in his direction. "He probably thinks he can fix it with his magic book." The words, though aimed at him, didn't penetrate the wall Elias had built around himself. His focus was entirely consumed by the intricate dance of gears and pistons, the subtle misalignments, the fractured connections. He could almost hear the machine groaning, a low mechanical moan that only he seemed to perceive, a cry for help from a silent giant. The sun continued its relentless assault, turning the air into a shimmering haze. The desperation among the farmers was palpable, each passing minute costing them precious yield, pushing them closer to financial ruin. The broken harvester stood as a stark monument to their helplessness, and Elias, in his quiet observation, was just another ignored detail in a landscape of despair. He was a ghost in their midst, a silent witness to a crisis he felt, in a way no one else could, but for which he was deemed utterly useless. The stage was set for a dramatic revelation, a silent storm, brewing within the mind of a boy dismissed by all. Elias was a boy cast in muted tones, a quiet observer in a world that clamored for attention. His hair, the color of rich earth, often fell across eyes the shade of deep moss, usually downcast, avoiding the harsh glare of direct gazes. He moved with a peculiar, deliberate grace, as if each step were a carefully planned maneuver in a complex dance only he understood. His clothes, always meticulously clean despite the dust of the farm, were simple, practical, chosen more for comfort against sensory input than for style. A perpetually slightly parted mouth suggested a silent contemplation, a mind constantly processing, analyzing rather than speaking. Internally, Elias inhabited a universe of patterns and systems. The whirring of the combine harvester, the specific hum of the tractor, the rhythmic creak of the barn door, these weren't just noises. They were distinct signatures in a vast auditory library. He felt the world with an amplified intensity, where the rough weave of his shirt could be a subtle irritant, and the scent of freshly cut hay a symphony of sensations. His memories weren't fleeting images, but vivid, crystalline recordings, each detail preserved with astounding precision, like a personal archive of every sound, texture, and light fluctuation he had ever encountered. His thoughts rarely followed linear paths. instead branching off into intricate webs of interconnected ideas, like a vast, invisible flow chart in his mind. When others saw a jumble of wires, Elias saw a logical circuit. Where they heard chaos, he discerned a hidden rhythm. This internal logic was his most profound companion, a reliable compass in a confusing world. It allowed him to deconstruct complex problems, breaking them down into their fundamental components with an ease that baffled those around him, though they never knew it. Emotional nuances, often expressed through subtle shifts in facial expressions or vocal inflections, were a challenge. Yet Elias possessed a profound, almost visceral empathy for inanimate objects and logical systems. The malfunctioning harvester wasn't just metal, it was sick, its broken parts causing pain. He felt a deep protective instinct for things that were out of alignment, incomplete or damaged, a need to restore their inherent order and purpose. This unique emotional intelligence extended to animals too, finding solace and understanding in their unfiltered honesty. He carried a deep well of unspoken words, a vast reservoir of observations and insights that rarely found an outlet. The world moved too fast for him to articulate the intricate pathways of his thoughts, or perhaps no one had ever truly waited long enough to listen. This silence wasn't emptiness, it was a sanctuary, a private chamber where his extraordinary mind could flourish, unburdened by the demands of conventional communication, allowing him to perceive subtleties others missed entirely. The sensory information he absorbed was immense, almost overwhelming at times. The vibration of the ground beneath his feet, the precise angle of the sun's rays, the faint metallic tang in the air from the broken engine, each element was registered and catalogued. This constant intake of data, while often exhausting, also fueled his unique genius, providing him with a holistic understanding of his environment, a tapestry woven from countless threads of detail that escaped the notice of most. He didn't just see the harvester, he felt its every ailing part. The setting was Harmony Creek, a small, tight-knit rural community where traditions ran deep and change came slow, if at all. The fields stretched for miles, a patchwork quilt of green and gold that formed the very backbone of their existence. The school, a squat brick building with chipped paint, stood at the heart of the town, serving as both an educational institution and a social hub. Here, success was measured in grades and athletic prowess, not in the quiet mastery of complex systems. Elias, with his silent demeanor and unconventional interests, was an anomaly, an unsolved equation in a curriculum designed for conformity. Mr. Henderson, the principal, was a man of stern demeanor and unwavering adherence to protocol. He viewed Elias's quietness not as a trait to be understood, but as a problem to be managed. Elias needs to engage more, he'd often say to Martha during parent-teacher conferences, his voice laced with well-meaning but ultimately dismissive advice. He needs to participate in group activities, speak up. How will he ever learn to function in the real world if he lives in his own? His words, though perhaps intended as guidance, reinforce the systemic bias against Elias's unique way of being. The classroom itself was a microcosm of this larger dismissiveness. Mrs. Gable, Elias's fifth-grade teacher, was perpetually flustered by his inability to maintain eye contact or respond to direct questions in a timely manner. She saw his intensely focused gaze on a stray thread in his shirt during a lesson as defiance, not as a desperate attempt to regulate overwhelming sensory input. Her lesson plans, rigidly structured and reliant on verbal participation, offered no space for a child whose brilliance lay hidden beneath a veil of nonconformity, reinforcing his status as an outsider. At home, life with Martha was different, though still tinged with the anxieties of a community that didn't quite understand. Martha tried her best, a beacon of gentle patience in a world that demanded quick answers. She understood Elias's need for routine, his aversion to loud noises, and his fascination with mechanical objects. But even her protective love couldn't fully shield him from the pervasive whispers and subtle exclusions that permeated their small town, especially when he was out in public, where differences were scrutinized. The farmhands, hard-working men whose lives depended on practical solutions, found Elias's quiet intensity unsettling. They'd often make jokes about Elias the eavesdropper, or Professor Peculiar, their laughter echoing across the fields, further cementing his isolation. They couldn't grasp that while they toiled with their hands, Elias was mentally dissecting the very machinery they struggled with, seeing patterns and solutions invisible to their conventional gaze. Their casual dismissals, born of ignorance rather than malice, were still deeply wounding. This environment, while not overtly hostile, was subtly oppressive, a constant pressure to conform to neurotypical norms. Elias was always being fixed, always being helped to fit in, rather than being understood and celebrated for his inherent strengths. The broken harvester, now looming large in the heart of Harmony Creek, became a physical manifestation of the community's biggest challenge, and, unknowingly, the perfect stage for Elias's ignored brilliance to finally shatter the preconceived notions that held him captive. Elias's unique abilities had manifested early, though they were consistently misinterpreted. At 3, he'd meticulously organized his blocks not by color or size, but by the subtle variations in their grain, a system only he could discern. In kindergarten, while others struggled with basic counting, Elias could instantly tell you the total number of leaves on a potted plant, not by counting but by an instantaneous pattern recognition that defied explanation. These were not mere childish quirks. They were the nascent stirrings of an extraordinary mind, dismissed as eccentricities. One afternoon, during a particularly chaotic playdate at a neighbor's house, a complex toy train set derailed, its intricate tracks hopelessly tangled. While the other children cried in frustration, Elias quietly approached the sprawling mess. Without a word, he began reconfiguring the pieces, his fingers moving with an almost preternatural precision. Within minutes, the entire track was perfectly restored, the train ready to run. A silent testament to his innate understanding of spatial relationships and mechanical logic. The parents, however, attributed it to dumb luck or just playing, failing to grasp the depth of his ability. His fascination with machinery wasn't just observation, it was a profound, intuitive dialogue. He'd spend hours in old man Fitzwilliam's workshop, not touching anything, but simply absorbing. He'd watch Fitzwilliam repair engines, his eyes tracking every twist of a wrench, every connection of a wire. Later, he'd draw diagrams in his notebook, remarkably accurate schematics of internal combustion engines, hydraulic systems, and electrical circuits, all from memory. These drawings, when stumbled upon by Mrs. Gable, were considered doodling or distractions from his schoolwork, never evidence of a burgeoning engineering genius. During a rare family trip to a science museum, Elias became captivated by a dismantled antique clock, its hundreds of tiny gears and springs laid out for display. While his peers rushed past to flashier exhibits, Elias stood transfixed, mentally reassembling the clock, understanding the delicate interplay of each component. He could tell his bewildered foster father exactly which gear connected to which, and how a slight imperfection in one spring would affect the entire mechanism's accuracy. His father, though momentarily impressed, quickly forgot the incident, attributing it to a child's fleeting fascination. Even his auditory perception was a window into his unique talent. He could differentiate between the subtle tonal shifts in different bird calls, identify a specific make of car by the unique hum of its engine from blocks away, and even discern the distinct rhythm of each person's footsteps. This acute sensitivity, often overwhelming in crowded environments, allowed him to perceive the underlying mechanics of sound, a hidden layer of information that most people simply filtered out, but which Elias processed with astonishing clarity, almost like a living sound wave analyzer. The small, consistent manifestations of his genius were like quiet ripples in a vast ocean, noticed by no one, or at best, misinterpreted as odd behaviors. The ability to recall precise dates, the effortless memorization of intricate patterns in wallpaper, the quiet correction of a calculation error on a chalkboard, these were moments where his brilliant mind briefly surfaced, only to be submerged again by the tide of normalcy and misunderstanding. His true potential remained a guarded secret, a magnificent blueprint hidden in plain sight, waiting for the right catalyst to be recognized. The constant dismissal chipped away at Elias, creating an invisible wall between him and the world. He became a master of quiet withdrawal, finding solace in the predictable patterns of his internal routines. Each morning, he'd meticulously arrange his pencils by graphite hardness, a small act of control in a life that often felt beyond his grasp. The schoolyard, a chaotic swirl of shouting and unpredictable movements, became a sensory assault, forcing him to seek refuge in the quiet corners of the library or under the shade of the old oak tree, where the rustling leaves offered a soothing white noise. His brilliance, far from being a source of joy, became a burden. The ability to see solutions where others saw only problems meant he was constantly aware of the inefficiencies, the illogical decisions, the outright errors around him, yet lacked the means to articulate them. This disconnect fostered a profound sense of isolation. He watched, an unacknowledged genius, as his peers struggled with concepts he'd mastered years ago, yet he couldn't bridge the chasm of misunderstanding that separated him from them. The silent scream of his unshared knowledge echoed within him. Mealtimes at home, often boisterous affairs for other families, were moments of quiet vigilance for Elias. He'd pick at his food, acutely aware of the clinking silverware, the scraping chairs, the unpredictable cadences of conversation. His foster mother, Martha, would often try to engage him, but her gentle questions, meant to draw him out, felt like interrogations, forcing him further into his shell. He sought refuge in the precise, comforting world of numbers and diagrams, finding logic where human interaction often presented only baffling ambiguity. The cruelty, though rarely overt, was a steady drip of emotional pain. The sidelong glances, the hushed comments, the way teachers sighed when he didn't respond immediately, these subtle rejections were constant reminders of his perceived inadequacy. He learned to anticipate them, to brace himself against the impact, but the sting never fully faded. His coping mechanism involved a deeply internalized world, a rich tapestry of thoughts and observations that he shared with no one, a secret garden where his unique mind could bloom unhindered. His only true companionship came from the inanimate. He'd spend hours with old radios, taking them apart and reassembling them, the predictable click of switches and whir of gears a comfort. The broken clock in the living room, dismissed by Martha as beyond repair, became a silent project, its intricate workings a fascinating puzzle. In these moments, with the quiet hum of machinery, Elias felt understood, valued, connected, in a way he never did with people. The machines didn't judge, they simply presented a problem waiting for a solution. The mounting tension in Harmony Creek over the broken harvester only intensified Elias's withdrawal. The desperation in the adults' voices was a new kind of noise, sharp and discordant, adding to his internal chaos. He saw their panic, their frantic, often uncoordinated efforts, and felt the familiar ache of knowing he could help, but being unable to break through the wall of their prejudice. His silent suffering was compounded by the unspoken knowledge that he possessed the very key to their salvation, yet he remained an invisible boy. The air in Harmony Creek grew heavy with unspoken fear, the kind that settles deep in the bones of a farming community facing ruin. News of the broken harvester had spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the small town. A local mechanic, widely considered the best in 3 counties, had spent hours hunched over the machine, his brow furrowed in defeat. "It's beyond me, folks," he'd announced to a somber crowd, wiping grease from his hands with a despairing shake of his head. "Looks like we're in real trouble. This ain't just a simple fix." The words hung in the air, a death knell for the season's crops. Mr. Abernathy, the farm foreman, usually a man of calm authority, paced frantically. His voice, hoarse from shouting instructions, carried an edge of desperation. "We need a solution now. Every minute this machine sits idle, we lose more than just money, we lose our livelihood." He turned to the assembled farmers, his eyes scanning their worried faces, then landed on Elias, who was, as usual, meticulously observing from the periphery. A vein pulsed in Abernathy's temple, fueled by stress and a simmering frustration. "Elias!" Abernathy barked, his voice cutting through the hushed murmurs. "What are you staring at? You think you can fix it? You with your little books and your silent ways?" A ripple of uneasy laughter spread through the crowd. The farmers, already on edge, looked at the boy with a mix of pity and annoyance. Elias flinched, his focus on the machine momentarily broken, but his gaze quickly returned, drawn to a subtle misalignment no one else seemed to notice. The sudden spotlight felt like a physical blow. One of the older boys, Billy, emboldened by Abernathy's words, stepped forward. "Yeah, Elias, why don't you wave your magic wand? Maybe your imaginary friends can tell you what's wrong." His taunt was met with more snickers, some of the younger children joining in. Elias's hands tightened around his book, his jaw clenching almost imperceptibly. The unfairness of it all, the sheer ignorance, was a bitter taste in his mouth. He felt the familiar urge to retreat, to disappear into his own world where logic prevailed and cruelty didn't exist. Martha stepped closer to Elias, her eyes flashing with a protective fire, but she knew confronting Abernathy now would only make things worse. The tension was palpable, thick with the scent of impending failure and the bitter tang of Elias's humiliation. He was being used as a scapegoat, a convenient target for the community's collective anxiety. The broken harvester stood as a monument, not just to mechanical failure, but to a deeply ingrained prejudice that kept a brilliant mind in the shadows. Abernathy, his face flushed, pointed a finger directly at Elias. "Go on, boy. Tell us what's wrong. You're always so smart with your observations, aren't you? What's the grand solution from the quiet genius?" The words dripped with sarcasm, intended to mock and belittle. The crowd watched, some with uncomfortable shifts, others with a cruel curiosity. It was a public shaming, a deliberate attempt to expose what they perceived as Elias's oddity and uselessness, a final, painful twist of the knife. A profound silence descended upon the group, thicker than the dust clinging to their clothes. Elias, his back ramrod straight, felt the pressure of every gaze, every unspoken judgment. He took a single deliberate step forward, then another, moving past the astonished faces of the mechanics and farmers. His eyes, usually downcast, now gleamed with an intense, almost unearthly focus as he approached the monstrous, inert combine harvester. He didn't speak, didn't acknowledge the gaping mouths or the disbelieving whispers. The machine, in its silent plea, was his sole audience. He didn't grab a wrench or a screwdriver. Instead, he knelt beside a section of the massive engine, his slender fingers tracing the cold metal with a feather-light touch, as if reading Braille. He moved with a precision that belied his age, his head cocked slightly, listening not to the shouts of the onlookers, but to the faint, almost imperceptible hum that only he could hear, the dying breath of the machine's complex internal system. It was a dance between boy and metal, a silent conversation unfolding before a bewildered audience. His hand reached into a tangle of wires, not pulling or yanking, but carefully, almost tenderly, adjusting a single, barely visible connector. His eyes narrowed, then widened, as if a new piece of a complex puzzle had just clicked into place. The farmers leaned in, their skepticism warring with a sliver of desperate hope. They saw a boy who had always been an enigma, now performing an almost ritualistic communion with a broken leviathan, his movements fluid and purposeful. Then, with an almost imperceptible shift, Elias moved to a section near the main drive belt. He paused, his gaze fixed on a small, rusted pin. Without hesitation, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, oddly shaped piece of metal, a spare part he had found weeks ago during one of his quiet explorations, a piece that to anyone else was merely scrap. He held it up, aligning it perfectly with the missing pin, and with a soft, decisive push it clicked into place with a satisfying thud. A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Mr. Abernathy, who had been poised to deliver another sarcastic remark, froze, his mouth agape. The silence that followed was deafening, punctuated only by the distant buzzing of insects. Elias stood up, brushing dust from his knees, his face devoid of triumph, merely reflecting the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved, a system restored to its inherent order. He looked at the harvester, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips, as if sharing a secret with the revitalized machine. And then, with a thunderous roar that shook the very ground, the colossal combine harvester coughed, sputtered, and then roared to life, its massive engine thrumming with renewed power. Smoke billowed from its exhaust, and the gears, once silent and mangled, began to turn with a smooth, rhythmic hum. The machine, which had minutes ago been a symbol of ruin, now pulsed with vibrant energy, brought back from the brink by the quiet genius of a boy everyone had dismissed. A stunned silence enveloped the field, a collective holding of breath that stretched for an eternity. The roar of the harvester was the only sound, a triumphant anthem cutting through the disbelief. Faces that had been etched with worry and frustration now contorted into expressions of sheer unadulterated shock. Farmers stared, mouths agape, their eyes darting from the now working machine to the small, unassuming figure of Elias. The skepticism that had clouded their faces moments ago evaporated, replaced by a dawning realization, a slow, silent acknowledgement of something extraordinary. Mr. Abernathy, who had just publicly humiliated Elias, stood frozen, his face draining of color. The sarcastic words he had hurled at the boy seemed to echo in the sudden quiet, haunting him. His jaw hung slack, his eyes wide with a mixture of shame and awe. He looked as if he had seen a ghost, or perhaps a miracle. The years of dismissing Elias, of seeing him as merely an oddity, crashed down upon him, a heavy weight of regret. The other mechanics, seasoned professionals who had painstakingly failed to solve the problem, exchanged glances of profound bewilderment. They approached the revived harvester cautiously, running their hands over the spots where Elias had touched it, as if trying to decipher the magic he had just performed. Their initial professional pride had been utterly shattered, replaced by a humbling respect for the quiet boy who had succeeded where they, with all their experience and tools, had failed so spectacularly. Billy, the boy who had taunted Elias moments before, looked down at his feet, his face flushed with a deep, uncomfortable crimson. The sneer had vanished, replaced by a look of bewildered embarrassment. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact with Elias, feeling the weight of his own cruel words. The other children, initially giggling, now stood wide-eyed, a mix of fear and wonder transforming their innocent faces. They had witnessed something they would never forget, something that fundamentally shifted their understanding of Elias. Martha, Elias's foster mother, was the first to move, a tear silently tracking a path through the dust on her cheek. Her heart swelled with a fierce protective pride. She had always known Elias possessed a unique mind, but to see it recognized, even in such a dramatic, unexpected way, was an overwhelming validation. Her quiet strength had finally found its public voice, channeled through the roar of the resurrected machine. She simply watched, a silent observer of the ripple effect Elias had created. The atmosphere on the field had transformed completely. The air, once thick with desperation, now crackled with a new energy, one of astonishment, admiration, and a profound collective respect. The silence was not one of confusion, but of processing, of minds grappling with a new reality. Elias, still impassive, had in a single silent act not only repaired a machine but had irrevocably shifted the perception of an entire community. Mr. Abernathy, his face still pale with residual shock, was the first to break the prolonged silence. He walked slowly towards Elias, his usual confident stride replaced by a hesitant shuffle. He stopped a few feet from the boy, his gaze fixed on the ground, before finally lifting it to meet Elias's steady, unblinking eyes. "Elias," he began, his voice rough, unused to the humility now coloring his tone. I was wrong. Terribly wrong." He extended a hand, calloused and grease-stained, not in a handshake, but in a gesture of profound respect, a silent offering of apology. The other farmers, emboldened by Abernathy's raw admission, began to murmur among themselves, their voices no longer filled with mockery, but with something akin to reverence. A few stepped forward, their hats clutched in their hands. Old man Fitzwilliam, who had always tolerated Elias with a gruff affection, now looked at him with clear, unmistakable pride. He nodded slowly, a deep, knowing gesture that transcended words, acknowledging a genius he had perhaps always suspected, but never fully understood. Then an unexpected gesture from Billy. The boy, still red-faced from shame, took a tentative step towards Elias. He didn't speak, but he offered a small, hesitant smile, a silent olive branch. It was a subtle shift, a crack in the wall of social exclusion that had surrounded Elias for so long. The invitation wasn't for play or conversation, but for an unspoken truce, a tentative bridge built on mutual, newfound respect. The change in the social dynamic was palpable, a tangible weight lifting from the very air. Principal Henderson, who had arrived drawn by the commotion, stood at the edge of the crowd, observing the scene with wide, disbelieving eyes. He saw not the problem child he had always categorized, but a quiet hero, a savant whose unique mind had saved the entire harvest. He cleared his throat, a sound usually reserved for announcing disciplinary actions, and spoke with an uncharacteristic softness. "Elias," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, we would be honored if you would consider helping us with some of our technical equipment." It was an invitation, an acknowledgement, an offering of real inclusion. Elias remained outwardly impassive, his expression unreadable. He didn't smile, didn't nod, didn't offer a dramatic acceptance. His gaze simply remained fixed on the roaring harvester, his world still primarily the logical one of machines and systems, but a subtle softening around his eyes, a barely perceptible relaxation of his shoulders, indicated that the weight of rejection, though not entirely gone, had lightened. The external world was finally aligning, if only for a moment, with the internal world of his brilliance. The shift was complete. Elias was no longer an invisible shadow. He was a silent catalyst, a turning point for the entire community. The gestures of respect, apology, and invitation weren't about him conforming to their world, but about their world finally expanding to embrace his. The broken harvester, now triumphantly working, was not just a machine repaired. It was a symbol of shattered prejudice and a new beginning, ushered in by the boy they had all underestimated. The long shadow of the setting sun stretched across the fields as Martha and Elias walked home, the rhythmic hum of the now working harvester, a distant, comforting drone. Elias walked with the same quiet dignity, but a subtle lightness in his step was perceptible to Martha. The usual tension that held his shoulders rigid seemed to have eased, a minuscule but profound change. The air was still warm, carrying the scent of rich earth and the promise of a saved harvest, a stark contrast to the despair that had hung heavy hours before. As they entered their small, familiar farmhouse, the comforting smells of Martha's baking, a scent of warm bread and cinnamon, enveloped them. Elias went straight to his room, a sanctuary filled with meticulously organized books, schematic drawings, and the silent company of his disassembled clock. He sat on the floor, surrounded by the intricate gears and springs, not working on them, but simply tracing their delicate curves with a contemplative finger, the tactile sensation a grounding presence after the day's overwhelming public spectacle. Martha followed him, her presence a gentle, unspoken comfort. She sat on the edge of his bed, watching him for a long moment, a soft smile gracing her lips. "Elias," she finally said, her voice a low, soothing murmur. You saved everything today. You really did." Her words weren't a demand for a response, but an offering of pure, unconditional acknowledgement. She understood his need for quiet processing, for space to reintegrate the profound events of the day. Elias looked up, his moss-green eyes meeting hers briefly, a rare moment of direct connection. He didn't speak, but a flicker of something akin to contentment crossed his face. He then picked up a small, perfectly polished gear from his collection, holding it out to her. It was a silent offering, a gesture of shared understanding, a way of communicating the complexity and satisfaction of the mechanical world that had just been his stage. Martha took the gear, her fingers closing gently around it. She understood. It wasn't about the spoken words. It was about the shared space, the mutual respect, and the quiet triumph. "It's beautiful, Elias," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Just like your mind." She squeezed his hand gently, a silent reaffirmation of her unwavering belief in him, a balm for the years of misunderstanding and exclusion. The evening descended, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The house was filled with a peaceful quiet, punctuated only by the distant hum of the harvester, a lullaby of salvaged hope. For Elias, the moment was not about external accolades, but about the profound internal satisfaction of having brought order to chaos, of having seen a solution where others saw only despair. He was home in his quiet sanctuary, with someone who truly saw and valued the extraordinary landscape of his mind. The reverberations of Elias's silent triumph echoed throughout Harmony Creek, initiating a gradual but perceptible shift. At the school, Principal Henderson called an impromptu staff meeting, his tone markedly different. He spoke not of Elias's behavioral issues, but of his extraordinary problem-solving abilities, urging teachers to recognize diverse forms of intelligence. Mrs. Gable, humbled by the harvester incident, began rethinking her rigid lesson plans, wondering how she could incorporate more visual and hands-on learning, creating spaces for students like Elias to shine without being forced into conventional molds. Conversations among the farmhands also began to change. The casual mockery Elias once endured was replaced by hushed respect, sometimes even awe. They no longer saw him as just the quiet boy, but as the boy who saved the harvest. Mr. Abernathy, in particular, took it upon himself to champion Elias, openly recounting the story of his genius to anyone who would listen, emphasizing his own mistaken judgment. This public acknowledgement by a figure of authority began to chip away at deeply ingrained prejudices, planting seeds of empathy. New opportunities, once unimaginable, slowly started to emerge. Principal Henderson suggested to Martha that Elias be allowed access to the school's newly acquired robotics kit, a resource previously deemed too complex for elementary students. The idea was to channel his inherent mechanical aptitude into a structured, supportive environment, offering him a path to explore his interests without the pressure of social conformity. It was a small but significant step towards genuine inclusion, recognizing his potential rather than just his perceived deficits. Within the community, the narrative surrounding Elias transformed. Mothers who had once cautioned their children to be nice to Elias now encouraged them to ask Elias if they need help with something tricky. The shift was subtle, a quiet evolution in perception. The fear of the unknown, which had previously fueled their exclusion, was gradually replaced by a curious respect for his unique way of interacting with the world. Harmony Creek was learning slowly that different didn't mean less. Even Billy, Elias's former tormentor, showed signs of change. He would occasionally offer a hesitant nod when he saw Elias, a silent acknowledgement of the seismic shift in their dynamic. The incident had forced him to confront his own biases, to see past superficial differences to the extraordinary talent beneath. It wasn't a friendship, not yet, but it was the fragile beginning of understanding, a step away from cruelty and towards a more mature recognition of others' worth. The transformation was far from complete. Old habits and prejudices die hard. But Elias had sparked a silent revolution. The community was beginning to understand that intelligence manifests in myriad forms and that true strength lies in embracing diversity. His quiet act of genius had not only saved their crops but had also cultivated a newfound openness and humility among the adults, pushing them towards a more inclusive vision for their children and their future. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows across Harmony Creek. Elias stood by his window, watching the last vestiges of light fade from the sky. The harvester's distant hum was a constant, almost therapeutic presence, a reminder of the day's extraordinary events. He was still Elias, quiet and observant, still living in a world of precise logic and sensory nuance. The transformation wasn't about him becoming someone else, but about the world around him finally beginning to see him as he was. His hands, still subtly marked with faint traces of grease from the machine, rested on the windowsill. He didn't crave the spotlight or the accolades. His reward lay in the perfect alignment of gears, the smooth operation of a system restored. The feeling of rightness, of order re-established, was a profound internal satisfaction that transcended any external validation. He was, and always would be, driven by the intricate dance of patterns and solutions, a silent architect in a noisy world. The path ahead for Elias would not be without its challenges. There would still be moments of misunderstanding, the occasional sideways glance, the lingering echoes of past prejudice. But one door had opened, one significant barrier had been broken. The community, though still learning, had witnessed his unique brilliance, and that knowledge, once seen, could not be unseen. He had shown them that genius wore many faces, and sometimes the most profound insights came from the quietest corners. He would continue his silent explorations, his deep dives into the mechanics of the world, whether through the pages of a book or the intricate workings of a forgotten machine. The difference now was the subtle shift in the air, a newfound acceptance, a willingness to listen even if it was to the unspoken language of his actions. He was no longer just the odd boy. He was Elias, the one who saw what others missed, the quiet savant of Harmony Creek. The last stars began to appear, pinpricks of light in the vast canvas of the night sky, each one a tiny, perfect sphere in a boundless system. Elias felt a connection to them, a resonance with the silent, ordered complexity of the universe. He was a part of that grand design, a unique and valuable component, just like every gear in a perfectly functioning machine. His journey was one of continuous discovery, both of the world and of his place within it. He turned from the window, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. The struggle for understanding would continue, a slow and ongoing process. But something fundamental had changed. The harvest was saved, not by conventional means, but by a different kind of vision. Elias, with his enduring dignity and silent genius, had not just fixed a machine. He had started to repair the fractured perceptions of an entire community, one quiet, brilliant act at a time.